Chapter 1, Part 1, London. It was the wedding day of Miss Elizabeth Dare and Mr. Edward Morton. Since the engagement, their marriage had been the subject of much speculation. Elizabeth was the only daughter of Viscount Dare, a very active member of Parliament, and Edward was the eldest son of Admiral Morton, who had spent the last 30 years at sea, fighting valiantly in dozens of naval battles. The union of these two prestigious families was one of the most highly anticipated, even in the small circle of London society. Even London's aristocrats, who loved to gossip about other people and were just as eager to badmouth them, found little fault with this particular couple. All they could talk about was the designer of Elizabeth's wedding gown and the wood used to build the furniture for the mansion Mr. Morton had prepared for his new bride. On the day of the wedding, a steady stream of people on fancy two-wheeled carriages and fine horses arrived at the church. The guest list was impressive, a real who's who of renowned aristocrats, politicians, and soldiers. Once all the distinguished guests were seated, Reverend Lloyds, who was to officiate the wedding, stood at the pulpit in his white robes. The room fell utterly silent, nary a whisper to be heard. Reverend Lloyds scanned the room, and after speaking a few words as convention dictated about how God was watching over today's union, he invited the groom to enter. The groom, Edward Morton, appeared at the entrance and marched down the aisle with the orderly, controlled gait of a soldier. He was a capable young man who had followed in his father's footsteps by joining the Navy and had been deployed to all sorts of far-flung places, where he had led several successful naval campaigns, rising to the rank of captain at the age of 29. However, it was not his military prowess or his family's influence that had made him famous in London, but his demeanor. He always had a stony, terse expression on his face, and his attitude was perennially cold and taciturn. Bucca demeanor was only appropriate when commanding a fleet, yet he maintained the same at all manner of social events, walking through Hyde Park on his way to church, being introduced to a lady at a ball, receiving an invite to a dinner hosted by a duke. Because of his attitude, many people who cared about Edward had to go to great lengths to convince others that he was not behaving in such a way out of malice. Even on his wedding day, Edward wore his usual expression, a firmly closed mouth and blue eyes wholly devoid of emotion. There wasn't even a hint of nervousness, let alone joy. Astonished by his attitude, the guests all thought, "What an insufferable man." Soon, all eyes, which had been focused on the groom, turned to the entrance of the church. There stood Miss Elizabeth Dare, dressed in a pure white gown and a sheer shawl draped around her shoulders. She was on the arm of Viscount Dare, who stood by her side, holding a bouquet in one hand. The bouquet was made up of the freshest and most beautiful blooms out of the thousands of flowers that decorated the church, but it could not hold a candle to the beauty of its owner, Miss Dare.